Manuel spent 7 years convincing Darlene that her skin was a cloak of invisibility. That in a city this cold, she was a shadow that millions would walk through but no one would ever stop to hold. He had hollowed her out until she believed that if she vanished tonight, the world wouldn't even blink. That was the lie she carried until she sat beside a man who looked at her injuries not with pity, but with the calculated gaze of a king assessing a broken treasure in a city he already ruled. The subway train screeched through the subterranean dark, a rhythmic clacking that echoed the frantic drumming of Darlene's heart. She huddled into her bright red knitted sweater, the wool itchy against the fresh welts on her back. Her fingers were white-knuckled, fused to the handle of her red handbag as if it were the only anchor left in a world spinning out of control. She sat on the far edge of the bench, shoulders hunched inward, a masterclass in the art of making oneself small. In the reflection of the scratched subway glass, a stranger stared back at her. Darlene barely recognized the woman in the window. Bruised, swollen, and bleeding. A deep, dark purple bloom had claimed the skin around her left eye, and the jagged, thin cuts from Manuel's heavy wedding ring tracked across her forehead like a map of her failures. She scanned the other passengers, but they were just blurs of indifference. Some cast quick, uncomfortable glances at her battered face before snapping their eyes back to their phones. Others simply turned their heads. This was the outsider's curse Manuel had used to chain her, the conviction that because she was a black woman in a foreign concrete jungle, no one would ever step into the line of fire for her. Every time the train slowed, the air in her lungs turned to lead. She could almost feel the heat of Manuel's characteristic rage, could hear the echo of his voice hissing that she was a disposable ghost. She was a petite woman, her natural curls now matted with rain and messy from the struggle of the escape. Her large eyes wide with a hypervigilance that had become her only heartbeat. She didn't know her destination. She only knew she had to outrun the man who claimed to own her soul. She felt like a hollow shell of a human being, fueled by nothing but pure adrenaline and the dying hope that, just once, she could finally be seen. The carriage was a vacuum, sealed tight against the weeping city outside. Each rhythmic jolt of the wheels against the iron tracks felt like a hammer blow to Darlene's ribs, a physical reminder of the time she was losing. In the reflection of the dark tunnel walls, she caught glimpses of her own face, a map of trauma rendered in shades of violet and crimson. Manuel's voice, a jagged serration in her mind, whispered that she was a stain on the pristine world of this city, a shadow that didn't deserve to take up space. He had spent years pruning her spirit until she was a miniature of the woman she used to be, convinced that her blackness made her a target and her isolation made her a victim. But the air directly to her right didn't feel like the stagnant, indifferent oxygen of the other passengers. It was heavy, charged with a cold metallic pressure that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Without moving her head, Darlene let her eyes drift sideways. Sitting there was a man who seemed to exist in a different dimension of reality. He didn't slouch. He didn't check his phone with the frantic boredom of the others. He was an anchor of absolute stillness in a moving world. His navy suit was so precisely tailored it looked like armor, the fabric catching the flicker of the overhead fluorescent lights with a dull, expensive sheen. But it was the ink that trapped her breath in her throat. Intricate, dark dragons spiraled up his neck, their scales disappearing into the sharp line of his jaw and the shadow of his slicked-back hair. Darlene felt a new kind of heat prickle her skin. This wasn't the volatile, sweaty heat of Manuel's impending violence. This was the refrigerated chill of a man who didn't need to scream to be heard. He was leaning forward slightly, his tattooed hands resting on his knees with a grace that suggested he could be both a surgeon and an executioner. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, but she could feel his awareness. It was a clinical, heavy attention, as if he were reading the story written in the bruises on her face and the way her fingers clutched her red bag like a shield. Manuel had always told her that nobody would ever look for a ghost, but this man wasn't just looking. He was assessing. In his presence, the orphan complex that Manuel had meticulously built around her began to crack. For the first time in 7 years, the fear of being caught was being crowded out by a terrifying curiosity. The man in the suit represented a world of discipline and lethal consequence, a world Manuel could never navigate. The train groaned, slowing down for an obscure transfer point. The screech of the brakes sounded like a dying animal. Darlene's heart hammered against her chest. A trapped bird desperate for flight. As the light from the platform flooded the carriage, she saw the man's gaze shift. He didn't turn his head, but his eyes narrowed, focusing on the dark glass behind her. In that moment of shared silence, Darlene realized she wasn't just sitting next to a passenger. She was sitting in the epicenter of a storm, and the man beside her was the one who decided where the lightning fell. The screech of the brakes was a jagged, metallic scream that tore through the artificial quiet of the carriage. As the train lurched to a final, heavy halt at the obscure transfer station, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting long, nervous shadows across the floor. Darlene felt the air leave her lungs. Through the scratched, grime-smeared window directly behind her, the platform lights bled an aggressive, sickly yellow onto the concrete. And then, she saw him. Manuel was a silhouette of pure, unadulterated malice, leaning against the cold tile of the station wall before he spotted the train. His face was a contorted mask of jagged rage, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a frantic, predatory triumph. He hadn't just tracked her, he had predicted her. He moved toward the sliding doors with a heavy, rhythmic thud of boots that seemed to vibrate through the very steel of the floorboards. Darlene! His voice bypassed the glass, a muffled roar of ownership that made the other passengers physically recoil. The ordinary people, the commuters who had spent the last 20 minutes looking at their shoes or the ceiling, suddenly found a frantic interest in the far ends of the car. They scrambled away, creating a hollowed-out circle of fear around the woman in the red sweater. Manuel's fist slammed against the exterior glass, his mouth open in a mid-yell that revealed the jagged edges of his teeth. To him, this wasn't a rescue. It was a repossession. Darlene's knuckles turned a ghostly white as she fused her grip to her red handbag. She felt small, a ghost being beckoned back into the grave Manuel had dug for her over 7 long years. The orphan complex he had meticulously cultivated flared in her chest, a suffocating heat that told her no one in this crowded car would lift a finger to stop a man who claimed to own her. But the man sitting beside her didn't shrink. Kang Song-hun didn't rush to stand. He didn't flinch at the violent thud of Manuel's fist against the window. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his chin lowering as he began to process the intrusion. The movement was fluid, like a predator shifting its weight in the tall grass. His gaze remained fixed on a point exactly 3 inches in front of him, his dark, narrow eyes tracking the trajectory of Manuel's aggression with a clinical, detached intensity. The sliding doors hissed open, inviting the freezing, rain-drenched night air into the train. Manuel stepped over the threshold, his presence a toxic cloud of sweat and adrenaline that crowded the aisle. He didn't see the man in the navy suit. He only saw the woman he had broken. But as Manuel reached out a meaty hand to grab Darlene's arm, the air in the carriage shifted. The cold, controlled pressure emanating from Song-hun became a physical wall. He was no longer just a passenger. He was a silent, tattooed judge, and the trial was about to begin. The threshold of the train became a fault line. As Manuel's heavy boot crossed the metal gap, the humid scent of his unwashed rage and cheap tobacco flooded the space. A familiar suffocating cloud that had defined Darlene's life for 7 years. He reached out, his thick, scarred fingers splayed like a claw, ready to sink into the wool of her red sweater and drag her back into the dark. "Found you, you little ghost," Manuel spat, his voice a jagged rasp that made the remaining passengers at the far end of the car flinch. "You thought you could just walk out? You're nothing without me. You belong in the house." Darlene's pulse thrummed in her teeth. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the familiar jerk of her shoulder, the sudden redirection of her entire world by a force she couldn't fight. She waited for the impact of his grip, for the heat of his palm to claim her skin. But the impact never came. Instead, a sound vibrated through the floorboards. Not a shout, not a challenge, but a low melodic hum that seemed to pull the oxygen right out of Manuel's lungs. It was the sound of a blade being drawn over silk. "Men who believe they own things," a voice murmured, "rarely notice when the world has already moved on without them." The words were quiet, spoken with a rhythmic, effortless cadence that carried more weight than any scream. Manuel's hand froze inches from Darlene's arm. He blinked, his bloodshot eyes finally snapping away from his prey to the man sitting in the center of the bench. Kang Song-hun didn't stand. He remained leaning forward, his tattooed hands relaxed, his index finger tracing the sharp line of his own jaw as if he were bored by the intrusion. He slowly lifted his gaze, his narrow eyes locking onto Manuel's with a lethal, clinical focus. The rule of invisibility that had governed Darlene's life was shattered in a heartbeat. The air in the carriage grew arctic, heavy with the scent of expensive cedar and the unmistakable ozone of a coming storm. "Who the hell are you?" Manuel barked, though the bravado in his chest wavered, his posture sagging against the sudden, crushing gravity of the man in the navy suit. "This is family business. She's an orphan. She's got nobody. You hear me? Nobody is coming for her." Song-hun exhaled a slow, controlled breath. He tilted his head slightly, the light catching the scales of the dragon snaking up his neck. "You are mistaken," he whispered, the smoothness of his tone acting as a cold warning that made the hair on the back of Darlene's neck stand up. "She is sitting in my shadow. In this city, that means she is no longer alone. And if you take one more step toward her, I will ensure you never take another step again." The silence on the train became absolute. Manuel looked at the dark ink on Song-hun's knuckles, then at the absolute, terrifying lack of fear in the stranger's eyes. For the first time in his life, the bully found himself looking up at a god. Darlene opened her eyes, her gaze darting from the man who had broken her to the enigma who had just claimed her safety. She was caught between two fires, the monster she knew and the silent power she didn't. But as the doors began to hiss, signaling the final departure, she realized the ghost Manuel had created was finally starting to breathe. The sliding doors hissed shut, severing Manuel's frantic, desperate shouting from the climate-controlled sanctuary of the carriage. Darlene watched his reflection disappear into the tunnel's maw, a shrinking ghost of a man who suddenly looked as small as he had always made her feel. Beside her, Song-hun rose with a fluid, athletic grace that made the cramped subway car feel like a dollhouse. He didn't offer a hand, nor did he offer a smile. He simply walked toward the exit at the next stop, his navy suit cutting through the stale air like a blade. Outside, a sleek black sedan waited at the curb, its engine a low, predatory growl against the rhythm of the falling rain. A man in a dark tactical suit opened the rear door with military precision, bowing his head in a way that made Darlene's heart stutter. This wasn't the world of ordinary people going home. This was a world of absolute hierarchy. She slid into the leather interior, her damp curls leaving a dark stain on the pristine hide, feeling like a stowaway on a ghost ship. The car moved through the neon-soaked veins of the city, a blur of blurred lights and hushed silence. Song-hun sat in the far corner, a statue of cool indifference, his luxury silver wristwatch catching the passing glow of street lamps. He didn't speak, but his presence was a heavy, protective weight that filled the cabin. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't at a house or an apartment block. It stopped at the base of a soaring glass monolith that seemed to pierce the very heart of the storm clouds. This was the Dragon's Den. The lobby was a cathedral of polished concrete and raw stone, guarded by men who moved with a focused, lethal alertness that mirrored Song-hun's own. They didn't look at Darlene with pity. They didn't look at her at all. To them, she was a shadow under their master's wing, and that was enough. The private elevator ascended in a stomach-flipping rush of silence, the city falling away beneath them until the lights of the metropolis looked like a handful of spilled diamonds. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling penthouse that felt less like a home and more like a command center. The air here was thin and smelled of expensive cedar and cold metal. Walls of floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of the kingdom Song-hun governed, a soaring vantage point that Manuel could never have dreamed of reaching. Darlene stood frozen in the foyer, her wet sneakers leaving damp, apologetic prints on the dark, heated floor. She clutched her red handbag to her chest, her small frame feeling fragile against the expansive, masculine luxury of the space. Song-hun shed his tailored jacket, handing it to a silent subordinate without looking. Underneath, his white dress shirt was crisp, the top buttons open to reveal the dark ink snaking across his collarbone. "Manuel told you that you were a ghost because you had no family to claim you?" Song-hun said, his voice a low, resonant hum that filled the cavernous room. He walked toward a bar made of raw obsidian and poured a single glass of amber liquid. He was wrong. In this city, having no one means you are a ghost who cannot be tracked. And in my house, ghosts are the most powerful weapons of all. Darlene looked at the dragon tattoos on his wrists and the surgical precision of the penthouse. She realized then that she hadn't just escaped a toxic marriage. She had been pulled into the heart of an empire. She wasn't just safe. She was in the den of the city's most feared man, and the invisibility Manuel had used to break her was about to become her greatest armor. The guest suite was a silent expanse of charcoal-colored finishes and oppressive luxury, a stark contrast to the cramped, peeling wallpaper of the apartment she had called a home. Darlene stood in the center of the room, her reflection caught in the dark, polished surface of a dresser. A woman in a sharp, professional uniform had already moved through the space like a ghost, leaving a tray of medical supplies and a set of midnight blue silk pajamas on the bed. Left alone with the rhythmic hum of the climate control, Darlene finally let her shoulders drop. With a hand that still shook, she reached up to touch the collar of the red knitted sweater. It felt heavy now, saturated with the rain of the streets and the stale terror of the subway. It was the armor of a victim, a bright signal of her pain that she had worn to hide the shivering of her soul. She entered the marble bathroom, a temple of white stone and recessed, soft light. Before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, she stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, she couldn't look. In her mind, she was still the hollow shell Manuel had spent 7 years hollowing out, a nobody whose only value was her obedience. When she finally lifted her gaze, the reality of her face hit her like a physical blow. Her oval face was a map of Manuel's final lessons. The dark purple bruise around her temple had deepened, and the swelling on her cheek made her large, expressive eyes look sunken and haunted. The jagged cuts from his ring were angry red lines against her warm, light brown complexion. "You have nobody, Darlene." The memory of Manuel's voice echoed in the sterile silence, a ghost trying to reclaim its haunt. But as she stared at herself, she saw something Manuel had never been able to fully extinguish. Beneath the trauma, there was a quiet, vibrating survival energy. She wasn't just a victim. She was the woman who had walked out. She began to clean her wounds, her fingers moving with a clinical focus she hadn't known she possessed. She dabbed the antiseptic against the cuts, the sting a grounded reminder that she was still alive, still present. She reached for the hem of the red sweater. As she pulled it over her head, she felt the weight of the last 7 years sliding off her skin. She let the garment fall to the marble floor, a heap of bright, discarded pain. Then came the denim jeans, the socks, the last remnants of the woman who had lived in fear. She stepped into the walk-in shower, letting the water hit her at a temperature that bordered on scalding. She scrubbed her skin until it glowed, washing away the scent of the subway, the grime of the rain, and the lingering memory of Manuel's touch. The steam rose around her like a protective shroud. When she finally stepped out and slid into the silk pajamas, the fabric felt like a different kind of skin, cool, expensive, and untouched by his rage. She sat on the edge of the oversized bed and looked back at the bathroom door, where the red sweater lay abandoned on the floor. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a storm in the making, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was running. She felt like she was waiting. The next morning, the penthouse was flooded with a sharp, clinical gray light that seemed to erase the shadows of the previous night. Darlene emerged from the guest suite, her petite frame feeling fragile against the vast, open expanse of the concrete foyer. She had traded the midnight blue silk for a soft charcoal sweater and dark leggings she found in the wardrobe, clothes that didn't scream for attention, but clung to her like a second skin. Her face still bore the map of Manuel's final lessons, the deep purple of the bruise now a fading yellowish green at the edges, but her large eyes were filled with a flickering, newfound curiosity. She found Song-hun in a glass-walled gym that cantilevered over the city. He wasn't training with the chaotic, uncontrolled violence Manuel had used to assert dominance. Instead, his athletic frame moved with a slow, deliberate strike against a heavy bag, each movement a masterpiece of efficiency and restraint. He wore a black sleeveless shirt, leaving the intricate dragon tattoos on his arms and neck fully exposed, pulsing with every shift of his muscles. Darlene stood at the threshold, watching the surgical precision of his movements. He didn't look like a man fighting an enemy. He looked like a man perfecting a machine. Song-hun stopped mid-motion and turned to face her, his gaze calm but intensely focused. "You look at the fist, Darlene, because that is what Manuel taught you to fear," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room like a low, melodic hum. "But the fist is only a tool. True power begins in the mind. It begins with the mask." Darlene stepped further into the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Manuel said power was about who could hurt who the most," she whispered. "He said I was nothing because I didn't have the strength to fight back." Song-hun's narrow eyes hardened with a brief, lethal flash of disdain for the man who had broken her. He gestured for her to stand before the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city sprawling out beneath them like a grid of light and shadow. "Manuel used your fear to build a cage. He wanted to see your eyes widen, to see your breath hitch. That was his fuel." He walked closer, his presence powerful but not crowding her, the scent of expensive cedar drifting around her like a protective shroud. Presence is not about being the loudest person in the room. It is about the absolute certainty that you belong in the space you occupy. It is about a mask that denies your enemy the satisfaction of seeing your fear. For the next hour, he didn't teach her how to strike. He taught her how to stand. He corrected her posture, telling her to pull her shoulders back until her spine felt like a rod of iron. He made her practice walking with a fluid, rhythmic grace that ignored the weight of her trauma. "Your eyes are your primary weapon," he whispered, standing directly in front of her. "Manuel wants to see the haunted eyes of a victim. Give him nothing. Look through him as if he were a minor inconvenience in a city you already own." Darlene felt her shame transform into something sharper, a cold steel that began to knit her broken edges together. She was learning that her isolation wasn't a hole to fall into. It was the foundation of a fortress. As she practiced the mask, staring at her own reflection in the glass, she realized that the ghost was finally learning how to haunt. The afternoon shadows stretched across the polished concrete of the penthouse, turning the glass walls into dark mirrors. Darlene sat on the edge of a low-slung leather sofa, her fingers tracing the hem of her charcoal sweater. The silence between them wasn't the suffocating, pre-storm pressure she had known with Manuel. It was a controlled, rhythmic quiet that invited the truth. She looked at Song-hun, who stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette of ink and silk against the bruised purple of the city skyline. "Why me, Song-hun?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper but steady. "Why go to these lengths for an orphan who has nothing to offer you? Manuel was right about one thing. I'm a ghost in this city." Song-hun turned slowly, the light from the dying sun catching the silver of his wristwatch. He reached for a cigarette, his movements possessing a grace that made the cavernous room feel smaller. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled a thin stream of smoke, his expression emotionally unreadable. "Being an orphan is not a lack of value, Darlene," he said, the low melodic hum of his voice vibrating through the air. "It is a specific kind of shield. When you have no one, you have no choice but to become your own foundation. I protect you because I know exactly how heavy that foundation feels." He walked toward her, the scent of cedar and cold metal drifting closer. "I didn't always sit at the summit of this monolith. I grew up in the shadows of men who looked exactly like Manuel. Men who believed power was something you harvested from the weak because they were too cowardly to face the strong." He looked down at the dragon tattoos on his wrists, the ink dark and permanent. "I was 10 when I realized that the only way to stop a monster was to become a god. I had no family to shield me, no name to carry me. I had to build my own armor piece by piece, out of the very invisibility they tried to use against me." Darlene felt a tightening in her chest, a sudden, sharp recognition. She realized that this man's terrifying presence wasn't born of privilege, but of the same hollow shell existence she had been fleeing for 7 years. "Manuel used my silence as a cage," she whispered, touching the fading bruise on her temple. "He told me that because I had no parents, no siblings, the world would swallow me whole if I ever left his side. He tried to erase me before I even had a chance to exist. Song-hun went very still, his narrow eyes locking onto hers with a lethal, focused intensity. He used your isolation to build a prison, but isolation is only a cage if you believe the walls are there to keep you in. To me, they are there to keep the rest of the world out. He leaned in, his voice a cold, resonant warning. Because you have nobody, Darlene, you have the rarest gift of all. You can become anybody. You are untraceable. You are a ghost. And a ghost that cannot be seen is a ghost that cannot be struck. You aren't a victim of your past. You are the architect of a future that has no record. You are the shadow that finally learned how to bite. Darlene's posture settled, her shoulders pulling back as she absorbed the iron in his words. She looked at the dragons on his skin and didn't see a criminal. She saw a man who had written his own history in a world that tried to leave him blank. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the strategist. The rain-slicked streets of the industrial district smelled of ozone and terminal desperation. Far beneath the soaring glass monolith where Darlene was learning the weight of silence, Manuel moved through the shadows like a wounded animal, his bravado stripped away to reveal a core of toxic rot. He was no longer the loud predator of the subway car. He was a man losing his grip on the only thing that gave him a sense of scale. To him, Darlene's escape wasn't a bid for freedom. It was a personal theft. He stepped into a basement that breathed with the scent of stale adrenaline and expensive tobacco. This was the territory of the rival syndicate, a world that usually chewed men like Manuel into a pulp. But tonight, he carried a key forged from 7 years of intimate surveillance. He didn't just offer Darlene's location. He began to sell out the very foundations of his own life. Under the flicker of a single, buzzing fluorescent bulb, Manuel leaned across a table scarred by old violence. He traded confidential police files he had intercepted, the locations of deep-cover safe houses, and the patrol schedules of the city's peripheral wards. He was gambling everything he had ever built, dismantling his own safety just for a single lead on Song-hun's Dragon's Denver. She has nobody, Manuel hissed, his voice a jagged rasp of misplaced triumph. She's an orphan ghost. But she's sitting in a room with a man who thinks he can keep what's mine. The men across from him, shadows with cold, clinical eyes, watched the way Manuel's hands shook. They saw the jagged rage in his bloodshot eyes and recognized a useful tool. A man so consumed by the need to possess that he would burn the city down just to see her in the ashes. Manuel didn't care about the war he was starting or the lives he was mortgaging. He only cared about the property he had lost. As the rival syndicate began to arm themselves, guided by Manuel's frantic maps, he felt a surge of lethal hope. He believed that by destroying the fortress she had found, he could force the ghost back into the cage. He didn't realize that in the world of iron and ink, the price of entry was often a life, and he had just signed away his own. The air in the penthouse suddenly curdled, turning thick with the ozone of an impending breach. Security monitors along the obsidian walls flared to life, capturing grainy, high-contrast silhouettes of armed men filtering through the subterranean levels of the glass monolith. Song-hun didn't reach for a weapon. He simply adjusted his luxury silver wristwatch, his narrow eyes tracking the movement with the same surgical detachment he had used to teach Darlene the art of the mask. When the private elevator hissed open at the summit, the silence was shattered not by gunfire, but by the jagged, frantic breathing of Manuel. He stepped into the foyer first, flanked by the cold-eyed soldiers of the rival syndicate, his face a contorted mask of toxic triumph. He looked disheveled, his clothes damp with the rain of the industrial district, a small man who had burned his own world just to stand in this one. "Darlene!" he roared, the sound echoing off the polished concrete. "Get over here. I made a deal. You're coming home to the cage where you belong." Manuel scanned the sprawling room, expecting to find the huddled, trembling girl in the red sweater. He expected the wide, glossy eyes of a victim and the desperate clutching of a handbag. He wanted the satisfaction of her fear. It was the only currency he knew how to spend. But Darlene didn't scream. She stood in the center of the vast, clinical space, her shoulders pulled back and her spine a rod of iron. She was dressed in the charcoal sweater and dark leggings of the Dragon's Den, her natural curls framed by the cold, expensive light of the penthouse. As Manuel lunged forward, intent on reclaiming his property, she didn't flinch. She met his gaze with a lethal, clinical stillness that mirrored Song-hun's own. The orphan complex was gone, replaced by the heavy, silent foundation of a woman who had realized her own invisibility was a fortress. She looked through Manuel as if he were a ghost from a life she had already outlived. In that absolute, terrifying silence, the predator realized the truth. He wasn't hunting a lost girl anymore. He was standing in a room full of gods, and the woman he had tried to erase had finally become the one thing he couldn't touch. The deal Manuel had mortgaged his life for dissolved into the sterile air of the penthouse. At a subtle, rhythmic wave of Song-hun's tattooed hand, the shadows of the dragon's den coalesced into armed men who moved with a military precision Manuel couldn't comprehend. The rival syndicate soldiers, recognizing a vacuum of power they could not fill, lowered their weapons. They were professionals. They didn't die for small men. Manuel was stripped of his bravado in a heartbeat, his face collapsing into a jagged mask of pathetic realization as Song-hun's security closed in. He wasn't a predator anymore. He was a nuisance being cleared from a pristine floor. As he was dragged toward the elevator, his screams that she had nobody became a muffled, distant echo, the final dying gasps of a 7-year war she had finally won. Darlene didn't watch him go. She didn't need the satisfaction of his fear because he no longer occupied any space in her world. She turned away from the foyer, her movements possessing a fluid, clinical grace. She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling glass and stepped out onto the cantilevered balcony. The rain had tapered off into a fine, silver mist. Below, the city was a sprawling grid of neon and iron, a kingdom of millions where she had once felt like a ghost. But standing at the summit, the wind pulling at her natural curls, she didn't feel invisible. She felt like the architect. Song-hun stepped up beside her, his navy suit jacket shed, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink of a lifetime of survival. He didn't offer a soft word of comfort. He simply stood with her, a pillar of unnatural stillness, looking out at the empire they now shared. "The world didn't swallow you, Darlene," he murmured, his voice a low, melodic hum. "No," she replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the dark clouds were finally breaking. "It just waited for me to stop running." She wasn't a victim, a runaway, or an orphan. She was a partner in the shadow, the woman who had traded a red sweater for a throne of glass. The storm had passed, and the ghost had finally found her haunt. We have come to the end of this story. Do you think Darlene deserved all that came to her? Let us know in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the Cinem Corner channel. Thanks for watching, and as always, relax, sit back, and enjoy the next story.